Happy Black History Month, everyone! Please consider donating to the organizations in the description of this video on YouTube. Alright, so let me get a couple things out of the way. 1. The title of this video refers to something which linguists call AV, which stands for African American Vernacular English. And 2. Not all black people speak like this. For starters, there are black people all over the world, and obviously not all of them speak English. But also, AV is a sociolect that many, but not all, black Americans speak, often in addition to Standard American English, or one of its geolects. If you don't know what geolects or sociolects are, check this video out. I'm not going to talk so much about the linguistic structure of AV in this video, but I highly recommend Langfocus's video on the topic if you're interested. It's a really interesting video, especially if you weren't aware that AV has a rule-based grammar just like all other varieties of English. In this video, I'm going to share my understanding of how AV came to be what it is. This question has been hotly debated by linguists for decades, but in light of new evidence in more recent years, the details of AV's origin have started to come into focus. A lot of people don't find the evidence convincing, but personally, I find it really compelling. Before diving into the evidence, I want to give a brief overview of the context. Just like all varieties of American English, AV developed in the Americas, but English is from England. Wait, no, Old England. Yeah, there we go, that one. Anyway, English wasn't spoken by many people in the Americas until the 1600s, when the English really started in earnest to develop the colonies in the so-called New World. The English jumped on the human trafficking bandwagon pretty late in the game. The Portuguese, for instance, had been at it for a while, since the 1400s. They'd been at it so long, in fact, that by the time the English got to West Africa, the Portuguese and West Africans had long since developed what linguists call a pidgin, which is essentially a new language that no one speaks natively. Since West Africans were using this Portuguese-based pidgin to communicate with Europeans, that's how things started out with the English at first too. But before long, the English started eyeing a more permanent place in overseas trade. And they set up shop along the southern coast of West Africa, specifically in what is now Ghana and Nigeria. By the early 1600s, they started building fortifications in West Africa from which they could defend their human trafficking operations. And as English presence became more permanent, the West African intermediaries, who interacted with them most often, gradually came to pick up pieces of English. But, like most people that came through the area, they generally only knew their own native languages, often in addition to the Portuguese-based pidgin. It's important to keep in mind that slave raiding was conducted over a huge chunk of the continent, and so, more often than not, people didn't share a common tongue. So the Portuguese and slowly increasingly English-based pidgin used in the fortifications served as a means of communication not only between the English slavers and West African intermediaries, but between the intermediaries and the slaves as well. In a sense, it was very likely here and under these circumstances that AV began to take shape. Or, more accurately, that Gullah began to take shape. To be clear, Gullah and AV are by no means the same thing. For those unaware, Gullah is spoken mostly in the coastal parts of South Carolina and Georgia, and it's a direct descendant of the pidgin I mentioned just now. Whereas AV is categorically a dialect of Southern American English, not a direct descendant of Gullah. But it shows heavy influence from Gullah in terms of vocabulary, prosody, and even a little bit of morphology. So basically the rhythm, and some words mostly, but also a couple of grammatical features. So essentially, what happened is, a number of the same West African intermediaries that learned English were eventually themselves exported to plantations, where they were tasked with overseeing and managing those compelled to work at the plantations. Despite being able to use English with their slavers, there was still more often than not a language barrier between the overseers and the rest of the enslaved, so they continued to use that pidgin, especially in a grammatical sense. Most of the words were actually basically English. It turns out that this pidgin very quickly crystallized essentially into its modern form. It's very likely, though not 100% certain, that happened in West Africa. But what is certain is by the time the first couple of sugar plantations had been established in St. Kitts and Barbados, it had already taken shape. This brings me to what I'm sure you've all been waiting for: the evidence. As it turns out, there was a place established by the English as a plantation colony with slaves imported from Barbados, where the imported West Africans toiled under their English slavers for about a decade and a half before the English decided that the area that is now Suriname was theirs to give to the Dutch, in exchange for what is now essentially the greater New York City metro area. Thus, in 1667, the various indigenous nations and American-born Africans of Suriname found themselves under a new ruler. For all intents and purposes, though, very little changed. The indigenous people continued resisting European encroachment, and on the plantations, the language that had been brought over from Barbados continued to be spoken by the majority of the people. Today, that language has evolved into what's known as Sranan Tongo, and it holds the key to connecting the West African Pidgin with the various languages now spoken in the Caribbean. Since this area lost contact with the English-speaking world in 1667, the Pidgin that became Sranan didn't acquire more English words or English grammar, whereas the other plantation colonies remained in very close contact with English and became a lot closer to it. Sranan did acquire some Dutch influence in the past few hundred years, but it still shares the majority of its grammar with languages like Jamaican Patois and the other English-based languages of the Caribbean. As a result, we can compare Sranan to these other languages and do some comparative analyses to determine what relationship they might have with each other. And in fact, someone has done just that. In his work, published at the turn of the century, The Missing Spanish Creoles, John McWhorter, linguistics professor at Columbia University, demonstrated the deep-rooted relationship that these languages all share. Links in the description as always. In short, the linguistic evidence is as follows. The AECs, or Atlantic English Creoles, share a large number of words and grammatical features. Despite many imported West Africans being from places like Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea, the AECs disproportionately share words and grammatical features with Igbo and Akan, which are spoken in Nigeria and Ghana respectively. And comparatively speaking, there appears to be very little influence from languages like Wolof, Mande, or Kru. Igbo in particular seems to have a very disproportionate influence on the EACs. Despite the Igbo's trigger warning for the text I'm about to show on screen. Despite the English coming to avoid taking Igbos to work the plantations. Anyway, the last piece of evidence is a small set of core vocabulary items they share that come from Portuguese. That last piece of evidence is what makes it possible to theorize that all Atlantic Creoles can be traced to the West African coast, and the Portuguese-based language that had been in use there for many decades, possibly centuries. And since we know that the Surinamese plantation colonies were founded in the mid-1600s and largely populated with slaves from Barbados, we can theorize that an early version of Suriname, and indeed the Atlantic English Creoles as a whole, was already spoken in Barbados by that time. Barbados, along with St. Kitts, being the place where the first English sugar plantations in the New World started. Indeed, it turns out Barbados was the source of many of the younger plantation colonies, from Suriname to Jamaica to South Carolina. That last one, if you recall, is where Gullah is spoken. So I started out this video talking about Av, only to introduce Gullah and give a history of that language instead of a history of Av, per se. Just to reiterate, most linguists agree that Av is not a direct descendant of Gullah, but rather a dialect of English in and of itself. That being said, it is clear that Gullah influenced the early form of Av, at least in terms of vocabulary, and that's the reason I wanted to give a bit of background for Gullah. So to recap, everything that I've explained thus far has been pertaining to the history of Gullah, and the other Atlantic English Creole languages like Jamaican Patois and Suriname. In the 14 and 1500s, the various native peoples of West Africa and the Portuguese came to create a new language called a pidgin on the West African coast. The English came in and used that same pidgin at first, but before long, the native peoples had replaced most of the Portuguese words in the pidgin with English words, and they were using this new pidgin, West African Pidgin English, to communicate with both the English and, in some cases, amongst themselves, since they had no language in common. In the earliest plantation colonies, St. Kitts and Barbados, some people were brought from the West African coast as overseers, not as plantation workers. And many of the subsequent colonies were supplied slaves from Barbados in particular. As a reminder, many of the details, and really the theory as a whole, is still debated, but again, in my opinion, I find the evidence quite compelling. Even though we can pretty confidently say that Av originated in or near what is now South Carolina, from a mixture of various British and Irish dialects of English, it nevertheless shows clear influence from Gullah. So ignoring the history of Gullah omits an important chapter in the development of Av. The evidence for Av not being a direct descendant of Gullah is a really huge difference between Gullah and Av. Even though some words and grammatical features appear to have been influenced by, if not adopted straight from early Gullah, the majority of the phonological and phonetic features of Av place it in line with the other dialects of English spoken in inland South Carolina and adjacent parts of North Carolina and Tennessee. In other words, Av exhibits nearly all the same phonetic and phonological features as the dialects of Southern American English spoken around the Carolinas and Tennessee border area. So despite the influence of Gullah, it makes more sense to understand it as a dialect, or sociolect if you will, of Southern American English, than it does to say that it's a descendant of Gullah. So getting back to the question in the title of this video, I hope I've made it clear that not all black people speak Av, or and Atlantic English Creole. Although obviously many people do, my goal with this video was to introduce folks to Av, as well as the various Creoles of West Africa and the Caribbean, which are all somewhat related, and so can sound similar. The clickbaity title was chosen in lieu of something that's more like the history or prehistory of Av, because that's more likely what people want to know. How many of you knew what Av was before this video? Or that it was related to the Creoles of West Africa and the Caribbean? You get a gold star if you did. Good job. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. Please share the video if you thought it was interesting, and subscribe and click the little notification bell for more videos like these. And don't forget to check out the rewards my supporters on Komuno get. Links in the downstairs. Thanks again for watching. Stay humble, stay curious, and peace.